What would you do if you walked into a bank to pay off a $6,000 debt? Money you had scraped together over 8 painful months, and the teller looked at you like he'd just seen a ghost. What if the number staring back at you on that screen wasn't $6,000 but $31 million? And what if the real shock wasn't the money, but the reason nobody had told you it was there? This is the story of how I found out my life had been stolen from me, and how I took it back. My name is Claire Monroe, and for most of my adult life, I believed that struggling was just something women like me did. I grew up in a small house in Dayton, Ohio, where the heat went off every February. Not because my mom forgot to pay, because Christmas always wiped us out, and the heating bill came due right after, when there was nothing left. She worked mornings at a diner and evenings folding laundry at a laundromat 2 blocks from our house. I used to watch her sit at the kitchen table under a single light bulb, scissors in hand, cutting coupons like they were $100 bills. And I told myself I will be different. I will be smarter. I will be more disciplined. I wasn't. I married Ryan Monroe when I was 28. He was charming, the kind of charming that lights up a room and then quietly asks you to pay for the drinks afterward. He always laughed the loudest. He always picked up the tab with a grand gesture and then whispered later, "Hey, can you cover this one?" I told myself that was generosity. It took me years to understand it was theater. We bought a modest house in the Columbus suburbs. Ryan worked in logistics middle management, a title that sounded more important than the paycheck it produced. I worked as a dental office administrator, and together we managed. Barely. Every month was a negotiation between what we owed and what we had, and the scale never quite tipped in our favor. Ryan's mother, Margaret Monroe, lived 20 minutes away. She was a precise woman, silver hair, always pinned tight, posture like she was expecting a photograph. She spoke to me with a particular kind of politeness, the kind that has zero warmth in it, the kind that says, "I am tolerating you." Ryan always said I was too sensitive, so I learned to be quiet about Margaret. The years went by the way they do when you're tired, fast and blurry. Our daughter Lily was born, then our son Tyler. The mortgage got heavier, not lighter. I picked up a weekend bookkeeping job to help cover the gaps. Ryan took up golf. By the time I was 43, we owed $6,000 in deferred mortgage payments, 8 months of falling behind while I juggled electricity bills, car insurance, and the kind of financial triage that nobody teaches you in school but that becomes its own exhausting expertise. I had finally saved enough to pay it all off at once. It wasn't triumph. It was relief. And for people who've lived with real scarcity, relief is triumph. It was a Tuesday in March. Overcast sky, the kind of gray that makes everything look slightly defeated. I wore my good coat, the navy wool one I'd found at a consignment shop 3 years before, because I wanted to look like a woman paying a debt, not drowning in one. The bank teller's name badge said Kevin. He had the pleasant, practiced blankness of someone trained to make transactions feel forgettable. I slid my account information across the counter and told him I wanted to apply $6,000 to my mortgage account. He typed some more, and then he stopped. His face changed in a way I will never forget. Didn't collapse. It simply drained like someone pulled a plug, until all the color was gone. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "could you look at this for a moment?" He turned the screen just slightly toward me. The account number was mine. The name was mine, Claire A. Monroe. And the balance on the screen read, $31,400,028.17. I stared at it. My brain did what brains do when they encounter something that doesn't belong in the world they've built. It rejected it. I thought it was a mistake. I thought he had the wrong account. For one wild second, I thought I was misreading the numbers the way you sometimes see shapes in static that aren't really there. "That's not right," I said. "It's your account number, ma'am," Kevin said quietly. "It's your name." He lowered his voice. "You should speak with a manager." I sat down in one of the chairs by the window without being asked. Outside, cars moved through the gray afternoon like nothing had changed. A woman pushed a stroller past the glass. Everything looked exactly the way it always had. But inside my chest, something had cracked open. Something between terror and the first edge of a question I was afraid to finish asking. How does a woman who can barely make her mortgage payment end up with $31 million in her bank account? And quieter, sharper. Who put it there? And why didn't anyone tell me? Perhaps that was the moment everything shifted. The moment the ground moved beneath my feet, and I didn't even know yet which direction I was falling. The branch manager's name was Linda Crawford, and she was the kind of woman who had seen enough to stay professionally calm through almost anything. But even she paused when she pulled up my account. Just one breath, controlled, almost invisible. Then her hands folded on the desk with the deliberateness of someone choosing every single movement. "Mrs. Monroe," she said, "the transfers came from an external trust account. The account is registered under the name of a Walter Calloway, deceased. Do you know that name?" I did, but just barely. And from so long ago it took me a moment to locate the memory. Walter Calloway had been my mother's older brother. Estranged, distant, a man I'd met exactly twice as a child. He had lived in Phoenix, worked in real estate, and accumulated, from the little my mother ever said about him, a comfortable amount of money. He and our side of the family had some kind of falling out I was never fully told about. He passed away sometime around 2019. I remembered my mother calling me, her voice flat, carrying a grief she didn't want to admit. "Uncle Walt passed," she said. "There won't be a service." He didn't want one. "He was my great-uncle," I told Linda. "We weren't close." "His estate," Linda said carefully, "appears to have designated you as a beneficiary. The transfers began flowing 4 months ago from a trust account managed by a firm in Phoenix." She slid a printout across the desk. "I'd strongly recommend you contact an estate attorney before you touch a single dollar of this money, and find out exactly what was in his will, and whether you were the only named beneficiary." I drove home in a daze. The house felt enormous and silent in the way houses only feel when you've just learned something that rewrites the floor plan of your life. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd clipped coupons, where I'd spread out bills and calculated how to stretch a paycheck across 14 line items of debt, and I opened my laptop. It took me less than an hour to find the first anomaly. Walter Calloway's estate had been settled through a probate court in Maricopa County, Arizona. Public records. I found the case number, the filing date March 2020, and the name of the estate attorney, a firm called Breer & Associates in Phoenix. But I also found something else. Buried in the procedural filings, in language so dry and bureaucratic it almost slid past me, was a notation that the primary beneficiary designation had been contested. Someone had attempted to redirect the estate funds. The challenge had been filed and then withdrawn. And the name attached to that challenge? Margaret Monroe, my mother-in-law. I closed the laptop. I sat very still. I thought about all the times Margaret had found reasons to go through Ryan's paperwork at our house. I thought about the time she asked me, seemingly casually, whether I had any family in Arizona. I thought about one Christmas 3 years ago when she had been inexplicably, almost aggressively kind to me for about 2 weeks, and then returned to her usual ice. She had known. She had known about Walter Calloway's estate. She had known I was named in his will. She had tried to contest it. When that failed, she said nothing. Not to the attorneys, not to me, not to a single soul who might have told me. How long had she been sitting on that knowledge? And what exactly had Ryan known? That night, after I put the kids to bed, I called my college friend, Dana. Dana was a paralegal at a family law firm downtown, and she was the kind of person who answers the phone after 10 at night without complaint. "I need the name of a good estate attorney," I said. "And a good divorce attorney. Preferably someone who can be both." A silence on Dana's end. Then Claire. "What happened?" "I'm not sure yet," I said. "But I think someone stole 4 years of my life from me, and I'm going to find out exactly what it cost." If only she had known then how deep the rabbit hole went. But maybe it was better she didn't. Some truths are easier to face one step at a time. Dana came through. His name was Robert Hensley, estate attorney, 22 years in practice, an office in a Victorian row house on 5th Avenue that smelled of old paper and lemon polish. He was in his late 50s. Deliberate. The kind of man who had long ago stopped needing to perform competence and had simply become it. He listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The fact that the transfers have already reached your account is actually advantageous," he said. "Whatever challenge Margaret Monroe filed in 2020, she failed. What she may have succeeded in doing, and this is what I need to verify, is delaying your notification. Can she legally do that?" "Not unilaterally. but with cooperation from someone inside the probate process, or a family member who had access to your contact information and made sure it stayed wrong, it's possible to slow things down considerably. He looked at me carefully. Do you know how the trust had your contact information on file? Who would have known both of your addresses over the last 10 years? The answer arrived before I wanted it to. Ryan, I said. And Margaret. Robert nodded slowly. His recommendation: do nothing visible. No confrontations, no transfers, no conversations with Ryan or Margaret. Just wait while he requested the full probate record from Maricopa County. I drove home with my hand steady on the wheel. Ryan was in the kitchen when I came in, heating something on the stove. He glanced at me with the distracted half-attention he'd given me for years, present but not quite there, like a radio playing in another room. You're late, he said. Errands, I said. He nodded and turned back to the stove. He didn't ask which errands. He never did anymore. I watched him for a moment. This man I had built a life with. This man who had stood beside me in a church at 28 and promised things. I looked for something in his face, guilt maybe or knowledge. But Ryan had always been good at the performance of normalcy. It was one of his most reliable skills. 10 days later, Robert called me into his office. He had received the records. He laid them on the desk between us with the care of someone presenting evidence, not paperwork. There are 2 things I want you to see, he said. The first was a document showing the original beneficiary notification sent by the Breer firm. It had been sent to an address in Columbus, a P.O. box on the east side of the city that I had never rented, never opened, and never heard of in my life. The notification letters, 4 of them over 2 years, had gone there, and because there was no response, the estate had simply waited. Who provided that address? I asked, though I already knew. Robert turned to the second document, an intake form, a form used to gather current contact information for beneficiaries. At the bottom, in a field labeled information provided by, someone had written a name, Ryan D. Monroe, my husband's handwriting, his signature, dated June 2020. I sat very still. The office around me, the shelves of casebooks, the framed diplomas, the afternoon light through the tall windows, all of it seemed to sharpen, the way things do when your entire recent history is rearranging itself into a new and terrible shape. Ryan had known about the inheritance. He had been contacted by the estate attorneys, perhaps through Margaret, perhaps directly, and he had given them a false address. He had intercepted the notifications. For 4 years, while I worked weekends and clipped coupons and lay awake calculating mortgage arrears, my husband had known I was the heir to $31 million. And he had made sure I didn't find out. This is fraud, I said. It is, Robert said quietly. And it's provable. What kind of man watches his wife run herself into the ground, watches her cry over heating bills, watches her stretch every dollar until it tears, and says nothing? I didn't answer that question out loud. But sitting in that chair, holding a document with my husband's handwriting on it, I felt something inside me finish turning. Not rage. Something colder. More useful. Certainty. The plan had 3 tracks. First, a fraud complaint filed with the Maricopa County Probate Court documenting Ryan's falsification of my contact information and the resulting 4-year delay in my inheritance. Second, a divorce filing in Franklin County, Ohio, citing financial fraud and concealment of marital assets. Third, a formal protective order on my accounts, ensuring the $31 million could not be touched, transferred, or contested while litigation was pending. I signed every document with the same hand that used to sign overdue notices. The protective order was filed on a Thursday. By Saturday morning, Ryan knew. He came into the bedroom at 7 a.m. and set his phone on the nightstand face up. On the screen, an email from his attorney acknowledging service of the divorce filing. You want to tell me what this is? His voice was perfectly level. That was always the warning sign with Ryan, not when he raised his voice, but when he kept it flat like a pressure valve holding. I think it's self-explanatory, I said. He sat on the edge of the bed in the posture of a man performing reasonableness, shoulders squared, hands open on his knees. You're blowing up our family over a misunderstanding, he said. A misunderstanding, I repeated. I was trying to protect you. The estate was complicated. There were tax implications. There were questions about the trust structure. My mother thought it would be better handled quietly before we brought you in. He paused. We were going to tell you. He hadn't even tried to separate himself from Margaret. You gave them a P.O. box that wasn't mine, I said. You signed a form in June 2020. The evenness slipped just slightly. That can be explained. I'm sure your attorney will try, I said. Get out of my bedroom. He left. 20 minutes later, Margaret's car pulled into the driveway. She came in without knocking, a small dominance she had maintained for 15 years. She stood in the kitchen doorway, silver hair pinned, coat buttoned, and looked at me the way she always had, like I was a problem she had never quite solved. I think we should talk, she said. I think you should speak with my attorney, I said. Her eyes didn't change. You are going to lose. The pleasantness she usually wore like a coat was simply gone. She hadn't bothered to bring it. You don't have the background for this kind of fight. You don't have the connections. And if you push this into a courtroom, I will make sure every financial decision you've made in the last 15 years is examined. Every late payment. Every overdraft. Every desperate little measure. Do you understand what I'm telling you? She let that hang in the air. Then, or you drop the fraud complaint. You negotiate a settlement with Ryan directly, generous, I promise you that. And everyone goes on with their lives. Emma and Tyler have a family that functions. You have financial security. And none of the very uncomfortable things that are going to come out in discovery need to come out. Uncomfortable things. There it was. The threat dressed in neutral language. The knife slipped in sideways so it didn't look like a knife. What uncomfortable things? I asked. You've made some choices over the years, Claire. Financially, professionally, choices that, taken out of context, might raise questions about your judgment. Questions a custody evaluation might find relevant. My children. She was threatening to use my children. Ryan stood just behind her, saying nothing. He had the expression of a man watching a controlled demolition he had helped design but no longer had the stomach to observe directly. He looked at the porch railing. He looked at his shoes. He did not look at me. And in that avoidance, I read something I hadn't expected. Not contempt. Shame. Real shame. The private kind that doesn't perform itself for an audience. It didn't make me softer toward him. But it confirmed something Robert had said early on. The weakest link in any conspiracy is the person who convinced himself he had good reasons. I breathed once slowly. Patricia, I said. I want you to listen to me very carefully because I'm only going to say this once. I let the silence sit for a moment. Every conversation we have from this point forward is potentially part of the court record. Every threat you make. Every implication. Every casserole dish. I looked at her steadily. So if you have something to say to me, say it to Robert Hensley. And if he says it's relevant, it'll be in the filing. Margaret Monroe's face did something I had never seen it do in 15 years. It went rigid. Ryan touched her arm, a small urgent gesture, and she stepped back. You're making an error, she said. Maybe, I said. I've made them before. I'm still here. They left. Ryan walked to the car 2 steps behind his mother, a position that told me everything about how that dynamic had always worked, and why I had been so slow to see it. I closed the door and stood in the hallway. My heart was beating fast. Faster than I'd admitted to myself while I was standing at that door. The word custody had landed somewhere real and frightening, and it was still ringing. But underneath the fear was something else. The knowledge that she had played that card because she was running low on others. Desperation has a particular shape. And I had just watched Margaret Monroe show me hers. The courtroom hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in January. I wore the navy wool coat, the consignment shop one, because I had decided long ago that I would not dress for anyone's approval. Robert had obtained everything. Certified copies of the probate intake form with Ryan's handwriting, phone records showing 11 calls between Ryan's cell and the Breer firm during the exact window when my contact information was falsified, and deposition transcripts from 2 witnesses at the Phoenix firm. My friend Dana, who had been sitting at my kitchen table the afternoon Margaret made her custody threat, had signed an affidavit. That hadn't been an accident. The judge was the Honorable Margaret O'Say. She ran her courtroom with zero tolerance for noise that wasn't load-bearing. Ryan's attorney argued that the P.O. box had been provided at the estate firm's request. He was smooth and practiced. Robert rose without urgency. Your Honor, if counsel is asserting that the Breer firm requested an alternative address, I have certified email correspondence from that firm dated June 2020, in which they explicitly state they already had Mrs. Monroe's current address on file and were not requesting any update. Mr. Monroe provided a new address without being asked. The documentation shows this clearly. Gerald Cole's smoothness developed a hairline crack. Margaret's attorney tried to argue that her 2020 contest of the estate had been a legitimate legal challenge based on concerns about Walter Calloway's mental competency. A challenge she had voluntarily withdrawn once she was satisfied those concerns were unfounded. It was technically a defensible position. And then Robert produced the correspondence between Margaret and Ryan from spring 2020, obtained through pretrial discovery. Margaret's own email, her own name, her own account. Ours lawyers don't know she's moved. Keep it that way for now. She won't look for something she doesn't know exists. The courtroom went very quiet. Margaret, across the room, looked at those words on the judge's screen. And for the first time in the 15 years I had known her, she looked her age. The stillness she had maintained broke. Just slightly, just for a second. Her chin dropped before she pulled it back. She leaned toward her attorney and whispered something. Her attorney's expression told me the whisper was not helpful. Ryan had gone the same color Kevin the teller had gone that day at the bank. Drained. White. Still. I watched him look at that email on the screen. And then look away. He is seeing for the first time what it looks like from the outside. Not a careful plan. Not protection. Just a man who watched his wife struggle and said nothing, because his mother told him to. Your Honor, Ryan's attorney said with noticeably diminished conviction, the email can be interpreted in multiple. Mr. Cole, Judge Osei said, in the tone of someone who has very little interest in multiple interpretations. I've read it. The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds. To me it felt like the ending of something very long. The ruling came 6 weeks later. I was at work when Robert called at 2:14 in the afternoon. I want you to sit down before I read it, he said. I'm already sitting, I told him. The court found that Ryan Daniel Monroe had willfully and deliberately provided false contact information to the estate of Walter Calloway, with the intent to delay or prevent his spouse's notification of a material inheritance. The court further found that Margaret and Monroe had, through documented correspondence, conspired to maintain that concealment. Both findings were referred to the Maricopa County District Attorney's Office for review of potential criminal fraud charges. On the divorce side, because the fraud constituted deliberate concealment of marital assets, the court largely upheld the settlement structure my attorney had proposed. I retained the house. I received a significant portion of the marital assets accumulated over 15 years. And I retained primary physical custody of Lily and Tyler, with Ryan receiving scheduled visitation. The $31,400,028.17 was mine. Fully, legally, uncontestably mine. I sat at my desk for a full minute after Robert finished reading. Phone still in hand, fluorescent light humming above me. And I thought about the $6,000 I had walked into that bank to pay. I thought about Kevin the teller going pale. I thought about my mother at the kitchen table under a single bulb. And I thought about every morning I had woken up afraid. Afraid for exactly 60 seconds before I remembered where I was standing and got up anyway. All of it had led here. By the following spring, Ryan had received a target letter from the DA's office. A plea negotiation had begun. He called me once 2 days after the ruling. I let it go to voicemail. He said he was sorry. He said he hoped I could believe that. He said he didn't know it would go this far. Didn't know it would go this far. Not that it was wrong. Not that he understood what he had done to me. Only that he hadn't anticipated the distance the stone would travel once he had thrown it. That is not an apology. An apology requires understanding the harm. What he expressed was surprise at the consequences. Those are not the same thing. I did not call him back. What I did instead, the evening after Robert called with the ruling, was drive to the school gymnasium where Lily had her winter choir concert. I sat in a folding chair that smelled of sneakers and floor wax, and I watched my daughter stand in the second row in her blue dress and sing with 11-year-old seriousness. The lights were too bright. The acoustics were terrible. And I thought, I am here. I showed up. I stayed in one piece long enough to sit in this chair and watch this. That was enough. That was more than enough. I paid off the full mortgage balance the next morning. I bought a craftsman bungalow in Clintonville with a deep front porch and a yard large enough for a garden I'd always wanted. Lily chose the paint for her room. Tyler chose a basketball hoop for the driveway. I chose the kitchen, north-facing windows, enough counter space that cooking finally felt like a pleasure instead of a calculation. Margaret Monroe sold her house and moved to Scottsdale the following year, starting over in the desert at 71. Was I glad? I examined that question honestly. No. Glad would have required me to care. And I had stopped caring about Margaret sometime around the moment I sat in that gymnasium and understood what I was actually fighting for. I cared about Lily singing in her blue dress. I cared about Tyler's basketball hoop. I cared about north-facing windows and a garden in Clintonville and a friend named Dana who texted on random Wednesdays about nothing and everything. That was a life. That was my life. And it had always been mine. Someone had just been hiding the key. If you ever walked into a bank expecting to pay a debt and saw a number on that screen that changed everything, what would you do? Leave me a comment. I read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you truly for being here.